Okay, we're going to start up in 1 minute. We're just accumulating participants, and we look forward to having a very lively exchange. We have guests from across the world tonight. That's actually the silver lining of a lot of Zoom webinars. And so as we get started, I would just like to promote, in fact, our next and last webinar in this series. The series has been called Climate Change in Communities, Lessons from Some of the World's Most Vulnerable. On February 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will have a discussion on adaptation and development, the worldwide search for policies to address climate change in vulnerable communities. And coming back to today, we have a very interesting lineup of panelists to talk about populism, democracy, and climate, adaptation in politically sensitive environments. And I think that leads me to want to speak briefly about the dichotomy between populism and democracy. That is, if democracy is government by the people, and populism seems to be sort of a means of conducting governance that benefits the leader's short-term prospects, or that is to say, a leader is populist if they think about their own interests and the short-term interest of re-election, let's say, rather than the longer-term interests of the nation. If that is the case, we can understand how democracy and populism might come into conflict, and we might see what is coming to be called climate populism. That is, populism related to climate, because climate is a problem that is hard to see immediately, but which of course we all suffer from in the longer term. And I think we have some really good examples today from Australia, Brazil, and the United States of cases of climate populism. So I will turn the floor over to our first speaker, just making the distinction between adaptation, which is sort of the ability to manage the risks of climate change and become accustomed to living with climate change, which is increasingly what many of us have had to do. Mitigation is actions to reduce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. As most of you know, a lot of countries, particularly the developed countries, are the main emitters, and they have been working on mitigation. A lot of countries, the most vulnerable, who have been featured to date in this series of talks, from countries like Bangladesh and Dominica, which we spoke of last time, are some of the most vulnerable countries who are exposed to some of the worst of these problems. Today, we will explore middle income and developed countries which combine efforts or lack thereof to mitigate and efforts or lack thereof to adapt. I think I'll, with that introductory statement, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Robyn Eckersley. She is the Redmond Berry Distinguished Professor in Political Science at the University of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She's a fellow in the Academy for the Social Sciences in Australia, has published widely on global environmental politics, international relations, and environmental political theory. We're very honored to have her join us fairly early in the morning, and we thank her very much.
Thank you very much, Todd, and to Charles for organising this event. It's a great pleasure to be on Zoom with you all. So I'm going to talk about the politics of the Great Australian bushfires in 2019 and 2020, because it's a story about our failure to adapt to a warming world in a country that's one of the most vulnerable to climatic impacts in the OECD. And it's a country that's a major climate laggard. So the question I want to look at is how the dots were joined or not joined in this extraordinary sequence of events. So what I'm going to do, this doesn't seem to be moving. I don't seem to be able to advance my slide. There we go. I want to tell, I guess, share a play in 3 acts. The first act are the fires themselves. The second act is the politics, and the third is the denouement. And I'm sorry to say this story is a tragedy. So let's start with the fires. This map tells it all. This is taken by satellite, picking up over previous 7 days and a date in January this year. And you can see how many fires were raging across the continent of Australia. You'll see in the bottom right there that it was particularly strong in the southwest there. So this picture here taken by satellite shows this picture. I used to holiday on the coast here. In the middle there is Bateman's Bay. So this is personal. Fires cause their own weather. So we had weird weather and a huge spread of smoke and a haze across large swathes of the country, affecting major cities like Melbourne and Sydney. And this is December. And I have to add, these fires started in September and they raged till February. So that's 5 months of continuous blazes in different places across the continent, but particularly in southeastern Australia. And so the health effects of this haze were very extreme. So people were wearing P3 masks and people with asthma and health conditions couldn't leave home. Even our Parliament House in Canberra was not immune from the huge haze taken in January, this photograph. There was huge damage. The data here I've taken from an inquiry into the fires, which I'll talk about shortly. There was an incredible loss of wildlife, and a lot of our marsupials are slow movers, particularly koalas and wombats, which waddle. There was a lot of wildlife rescue, and this broke the heart of Australians because we love our wildlife. And a lot of them are still in care, terribly burnt. I mean, kangaroos can jump and move fast, but a lot of kangaroos got terribly burnt as well. So this is a tragic story for a continent that's suffering huge rates of extinction because we're a mega diverse continent. There were 33 lives lost, including 3 folk from the US who volunteered to assist with aerial bombing. Over 3,000 homes lost, terrible smoke hazes, 3 billion animals killed, and the estimates of the impacts are really quite rubbery, but upward of $10 billion. So that's, I've moved through this very quickly because the focus here is on the politics. So that's the backdrop. Now, the story we need to start with here, and this is a context to Act 2, is that Australia is well known as a climate laggard. We are amongst the highest per capita emitters. We're in the top 20, the major league, we're ranked 14. We're the biggest coal exporter in the world, the 3rd biggest fossil fuel exporter, and the 5th largest fossil fuel miner in the world. But we have quite pitiful 2030 targets under the Paris Agreement, given that developed countries are supposed to lead in mitigation. But most of all, we have no credible policies or long-term strategy to deal with this problem. We don't have a renewable energy target. It expired this year and the government has not produced a new one. Instead, they're aggressively promoting fossil fuels. They approved in the year of the Paris negotiations a mega mine called the Adani mine in Queensland, a massive coal mine, despite a huge popular protest, a national orchestrated campaign. They're playing quite an obstructive role in the Paris rulebook, particularly over accounting rules. When our current Prime Minister was Treasurer in 2018, he ceased any further contributions to the Green Climate Fund. And not surprisingly, we're ranked number 56 out of the 61 countries that were surveyed in the Climate Change Performance Index. The only cold comfort is that we beat America, which came last. Now, I hasten to add that a lot of subnational governments are doing a lot of action here, and in the questions I can address that if people are interested. So that's the backdrop. So now the drama starts. In 2019, which was the hottest year on record in Australia, and on the back of a very long drought, a group of 23 retired emergency services chiefs got together, this is at the state level, and they produced a statement, a joint statement highlighting the risks of a major fire in the coming summer, warning that we don't have enough firefighters because all rural firefighters in Australia are volunteers. We don't have a professional service. And they give up their time and their job and their income to fight fires for the community. We don't have enough aerial equipment for water bombing. And they said we needed to have a national capacity. They called for aggressive emissions reduction, and they requested a meeting with Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, and asked for an inquiry. But the Prime Minister refused to meet them. In 2019, once the fires were raging, on many public presentations, interviews with the ABC and so forth, Morrison refused to accept a direct link between the fires and climate change and our activity in Australia. So you can see here, he cherry picks of all the statistics that I've thrown at you. One that looks quite modest is that our contribution to the aggregate global emissions is 1.3%. So he plays it up as a small amount, even though we're 14th in the major league of emitters, and saying that there's no connection here. The Deputy Prime Minister, who also is leader of the national parties, went on the, he was much more aggressive in saying that there's no connection, and what it's like, don't talk about the war. Let's our hearts and thoughts go to all those who are suffering, and we don't need to hear from these woke capital city greenies at this time when these folk are trying to save their time. So beat up the greenies and show sympathy for those suffering, but whatever, do not join the dots. However, the Prime Minister made an ill-fated decision to take a holiday in Hawaii during the fires. It wasn't many days, but he didn't tell us. And when it was found out, many people were completely angry with him for this was a national emergency. Where was our national leader? Why wasn't he here supporting us? Now, the backstory is this, that he used to be an advertising man working for Tourism Australia, and he presided over an advertisement that said, "Where the bloody hell are you?" It was supposed to be funny, it's Australian humour, but it didn't travel. The idea is, where are all you tourists in the world? Why aren't you here in Australia? So this became hashtag, "Where the bloody hell are you?" referring to the Prime Minister. And so this meme went round, and it was, it did a lot of damage to his leadership approval. So when he returned, he tried to make amends. Now, this is a still from a film taken in a little New South Wales town called Cobargo. The main street was burned down and ravaged. He tried to shake hands with this pregnant woman who stared him down and refused to shake his hands. She was so disgusted with his absence from the country during a national emergency. So he had a lot of making up to do. Meanwhile, The Australian, which is the major daily owned by News Corp, which is a Murdoch press, which has consistently peddled climate denialism and scepticism, as well as a number of nationalist populist radio broadcasters and shock jocks, ran a story about basically denying any connection with climate change. And there were three main discourses. It's caused by arsonists, not climate change. It's the failure to reduce the fuel load through backburning, and it's those damn greenies for trying to protect forests and stop burning of fuel load, which is a blatant lie. But these arguments were pressed very hard. However, in a survey conducted in January, right when the fires were at their worst, you can see here, those in orange were not directly impacted. The colour coding should have been the opposite. Those who were, you can see, I won't have time to go through all of these, but government should mobilise all of society to tackle climate change like they mobilised, it goes on to say, during the war. 77% of those affected. And these were a lot of conservative bush people. By bush, we mean people who live in the country, farmers, graziers, and so forth. They were really rattled by this. They were directly affected. So this really changed their views. Well, many of them already had, were already worried about fire, because we're talking about the need for adaptation here, not just mitigation. 30% no connection. So these were those that went along with the nativist populist media. This is a really interesting poll that's been going from 2006. It's an interesting U-shaped curve. We can talk about that later perhaps. But in the year leading up to the fires, 6 in 10 Australians accept that global warming is a serious problem, that we should take action irrespective of whether it costs a lot. Only 10% are sceptical. So Act 3, the denouement. In February, the federal government commissioned a Royal Commission. Now, Royal Commission in Australia is by letters patents from the Crown, the Governor-General acting on behalf of Queen Elizabeth of England, a weird system, I know. But it's very serious. The Royal Commissioners have power to summon witnesses, call for evidence, conduct hearings. So this commission ran from February through to October this year. And this is the report. Now, I don't have time to go through all the recommendations. There were 80. A couple of interest that we do need to have an aerial capacity. The federal government should invest in waterbombing aircraft, that we should pay a lot more attention to Indigenous fire burning practices. They've been on this continent for 60,000 years, practicing fire stick farming where they do regular cool burning. So the eucalyptus forests in Australia have co-evolved with these practices. And these practices stopped great conflagrations. And so now there's a lot of interest in bringing in that Indigenous knowledge. And this was one of the recommendations. There were many more. Now, the government has accepted in principle most of those. But what was interesting was the Royal Commission avoided any blame for the fires and did not mention mitigation at all, even though it was there in the terms of reference in relation to adaptation, but those dots weren't joined. Now, Australia's first infection with COVID occurred in February when the fires were still raging. And what makes this whole saga a tragedy is that it pretty much eclipsed political attention on the fires once they were put out. So the conclusion is that while the federal government accepted in principle most of the recommendations, which to do with national disaster preparedness, because the Royal Commission's key finding was that our disaster risk future was alarming, that our summers would be longer, more extreme, hotter, that the whole panoply of different disasters, not just bushfires, but floods and so forth, were going to start happening on stilts, on steroids. And we needed to really have a national adaptation plan, an advisory body and so forth. So these were important recommendations. But the government has still refused to join the dots on the fires. And if we're talking about populism and democracy here, this government is representing around 10% of Australians. We have a big climate change movement in this country, but they're not being represented. And our COVID recovery economic policy is gas-led. So even though growing emissions from the gas sector are cancelling out our sufficient gains from growth in renewable energy. So altogether, this is a tragic story. So you have to stick back and say, what's happening to democracy in Australia, given those polls, given only a small percentage of the country agree with those shock jocks? What's wrong with our democracy? So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robyn. That was a very illuminating talk. And I guess the question of what is happening to democracy also applies in Brazil. And we are very honored to have with us also Cristina Aoki Inoue, who's an associate professor of international relations at the University of Brasilia, where she is researching socio-biodiversity value chains and bioeconomy in the Brazilian Amazon through a global sustainability governance lens. She's been very active in international conferences and associations, and today will present to us on the circumstances in Brazil's climate populism. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Can you see my screen or not yet? Yeah. Okay, so good evening or good morning. Thank you for this invitation. So I'm also going to share a tragic story, as Robyn said, but that's now here in the Global South, it is in Brazil. So I'm not only focused on climate, but on what you call social environmental politics in Brazil. And my story is when inactions is action, or when inactions is an anti-climate and anti-social environmental policy. So I also structured my presentation in 3 pieces or 3 parts. First, I'm going to show a little bit of this, what I call the social, environmental, climatic crisis in Brazil that joins deforestation, dispossession, violence, and COVID-19. So a little bit of our so-called policies or non-policies, and how it's really, and also some data on democracy, but also on resistance and how the checks and balances within the state and also civil society and business can present some kind of hope. So this data of deforestation data was released this Monday. This is the official data in Brazil. And if you can see 2020, there was deforestation increased from in relation to last year. But also, if you see the trend, we had very high deforestation rates until the beginning of the 2000s. And so in 2004, more or less, deforestation started to decrease due mainly to policies. So there was a very aggressive policy to halt deforestation, to combat deforestation, mainly in the Amazon. And so really the policy was very effective to decrease deforestation until 2012 was the lowest rate. So it started to increase again, but it's speaking like now it's above 10,000 square kilometers. That's very high. And so these are the numbers, like the total deforestation in the Amazon from August 1st to July 31st, 2020, so was 11,088 square kilometers. This represents a 9.5 increase in relation to last year. But if you see how was the rate in 2012, you see that has more than doubled. So, and that's very bad because all the commitments that Brazil had internationally, like in the Paris Agreement and the Copenhagen Accord, but also in the national policy against to control the climate change, the target was to be below or around 3,000 square kilometers by this year. So we are much above the target. So, but also what I want to call the attention is that most of the emissions in Brazil are from land use change. So if you see here, they're mainly deforestation, right? See, and how it has increased in 2018, in 2019, and also now 2020. I don't have this for land use change, but this is the same trend. So, and because of that, because of the increase in deforestation, Brazil will be probably, perhaps together with Australia, among the biggest emitters, among the biggest emitters in the world. Brazil will be one that has really increased the first emissions this year, even with the pandemics and even with the economic crisis. So this is just a picture to see, and the deforestation in the Amazon is very irrational because mainly they clear the forest to put cattle, and so after cattle comes soybeans. So more or less, this is what they call the deforestation cycle. And but what I would like to call the attention is also that it's not only deforestation, but Brazil is a mega diverse country, but also social diverse country. Like you have indigenous peoples that live in the forest. You have what we call traditional communities that live from the forest, people who are collectors, they collect nuts, they fish. So there's a very large traditional populations that depend on biodiversity, depend on the forests for their livelihoods. And so these things are all linked together. We call in Brazil social environmentalism, and that connects, make the causal connection between deforestation, emissions, biodiversity loss, human rights abuses, and also now the COVID crisis in Brazil. So we have criminal fires that have devastated the Amazon and the Cerrados in 2020, but also with this same process is land dispossession, human rights abuses, and also we have this whole COVID-19 crisis in indigenous lands. So this is a very, that's why we call it social environmental crisis. These are just some numbers. They are all, sorry, they are in Portuguese, but this is to show that the Brazilian civil society, some NGOs and think tanks, they try to put together the numbers to show this relationship between deforestation, murders, or conflicts for land, labor conflicts, conflicts for water. So many kinds of conflicts in Brazil are related to deforestation. So it's not only deforestation, it's not only emissions, but they all come together. So these are some numbers related to indigenous lands conflicts. You see that there are many cases in the whole, like Brazil is a federal country as the United States. So you, in every federal unit, you have many kinds of conflicts related to indigenous lands, but also violence against indigenous persons, like not on, like you have murderers, like 133 here, you see the numbers, but also all kinds of power abuses, threats, and land invasions, racial discrimination, also attempts of murders and all kinds of violence. So, but another face of this, while we have deforestation in the Amazon that's increasing, we have a very serious crisis with COVID-19, because as you know, usually indigenous peoples, they have been, since colonization, they are very vulnerable to diseases that are brought from outside to their lands. So together with deforestation, together with violence, now we have this kind of violence. Like, these are just one kind of protest about all the indigenous people that were being killed by COVID-19. So particularly in the Yanomami case, this is the Yanomami lands are the very north of Brazil. It's a very pristine area of forest. I don't know if people have, there's one very well-known Yanomami leader called Davi Yanomami, who has written The Fall of the Sky, Falling Sky, that's the name in English. And they are now protesting this. They have created this movement that's called Go Out, Get Away. I don't know, I could not find the translation, for against mining, illegal mining, and against COVID-19. So this is the curve of COVID in their land that's growing up quickly, and that's very complicated. And this and COVID was brought to their land by illegal miners, illegal gold miners. Right now, they have around 20,000 legal miners inside their land. So they, besides invading their lands, besides they have taken the virus to their lands, and now you have a health crisis together with deforestation, together with land invasion. So this is the numbers for Brazil for COVID-19, but also for the indigenous lands. So you have like more than 3,000 indigenous peoples that are being infected by the virus, and more than 400, almost this number of December 1st, but more than 400 deaths of COVID since this health crisis started. So that's why we say in Brazil that we have a social environmental crisis. It's not only climate, but all together. And the social environmental movement in Brazil has this underlying assumption that we cannot separate the ecological from the social sustainability. We cannot separate it from social justice, cultural diversity, participation, recognition of many voices, and many knowledge systems. And now that we have also in Brazil a government that's populist, that is really, besides not doing anything, they just praise people who invade the lands. they really say that the Amazon should be developed, and they say that all things like climate is a flaw. They say they are climate deniers. Some people say that the earth is flat. They don't believe in science. You all know this whole scenery. So this whole denial of climate, of democracy, of participation is, in my view, has this, the result is just tragedy. And this is the democracy index that was published by the Economist Intelligence Unit. So you see, like, Brazil is considered flawed democracy. So this is Latin America. You see Brazil is right here with the overall score of only 6.8. So to be considered a full democracy, you have to be above 8. And if you see all the scores, it's functioning governments. See, that's how you have a very low score for Brazil. And I think what still is holding us together is because we still have civil liberties. We still can have like free media. We still have a civil society participation to a certain extent, because, for instance, some public employees or researchers have been called into justice just because they have criticized the government. For instance, they threat us, for instance, because I'm a public servant, I'm a professor at the public university in Brazil. If they don't like what I say, they can say that I'm going against my whatever civil servant rule of conduct, and I could be sued by my government just because I'm showing you the data of Brazil. So that's the more or less what we have. Now, how did you arrive to this? Like before 2019, at least we were not doing perfectly well, but at least we had policy, at least we had an institutional structure to take care of indigenous peoples, climate change, environment. But right now, what's happening in Brazil is that besides the government being a denier, we don't have policies anymore. All the policies are halted, like they are being underfunded. Inside the Ministry of the Environment, there was a secretariat, like one organization, just to take care of climate within the climate, within the Ministry of the Environment, for instance. They just got rid of it. And now you just have like one, if you look at the structure of the Ministry of the Environment, you just see their international affairs and climate change. So the whole policy was dismantled. The policy to control deforestation was dismantled. And so the result is that, because once we had a policy, it was proved that it was possible to control deforestation. It was possible to see that to foster indigenous lands, or to foster some policies for traditional communities. But right now, all this was dismantled. So there are some NGOs that are trying to keep track of this. So, and the problem is they do this under the law. So they use all the what we call infra law, like resolutions, decrees, to deregulate, to flexibilize, to do institutional reform. This is the numbers I got from 2018, 2019. Like they have like measures, 31 measures to deregulate, 35 to flexibilize, whatever they call it, institutional reforms. And mainly these institutional reforms are to restrict civil society participation, to diminish the seats that civil society or private sectors have in the councils, for instance. They tried to get rid of the National Council for the Environment, but as they could not, because that was set by law, so they decided to just to decrease the number of seats for civil society. And all these councils that were created, that were not created by law, they got rid of them. Brazil had the Amazon Fund that was with resources from Germany and Norway. And they have like 2,000.9 billion reais. And this, since last year, they stopped. The money is there, but nothing is being done. The climate fund was stopped, and just so I think 2 months from now they started a little bit, but not to tackle deforestation, things like that. But they're using the money, like 5% of the money, for solid waste. So this is just an example of numbers of what this NGO that makes this month by month, what they're doing per month. They're all signs that we have to take a look to see what could be behind them. This is just like how how you don't do by not executing the budget. So if you see the numbers of the budget here for like climate, sustainable conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, environmental quality, if you see the numbers here for 2019, and if you see how was executed, you see that's very low. Like here, 6-25. If you see all the numbers here, you see that they are not doing, they don't use the money that they have. It's very little money, but even the little money they have, they don't do anything. Like you see here, how much was executed in 2019, only like 25% of climate change. And you see that very little has been executed for budget. But now talking more like, what is happening is that for the Amazon particularly, there are many visions. Like one vision could be a more social environmental, like that is possible to live with the forest and through the forest and still increase well-being of people, human development. But not, right now, it's more this traditional view of development, that you have to clear the forest to build big infrastructure, dams, ports, highways, and all that. So that's the view that's prevailing. But because of the economic crisis, at least they are not doing any big infrastructure, but they are not halting deforestation. And so now the third part, what I want to say is, what do we have to do? Like we don't have policy, the only thing we have is resistance, either by civil society that's mobilizing, trying to resist, litigation, and also Congress. So that's how we are trying to not, at least to avoid damage. We cannot, as they are not doing anything, at least the policy now is, at least from civil society and from the movements, is try to avoid the risk. And from outside, we also have the pressure. This is Greta Thunberg and what she said about the Minister of the Environment, who said in May, let the cattle the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil has said that they should take the opportunity of COVID-19 crisis to pass other regulations to unregulate in the environment. So that's Greta's tweet. Has said, well, if they say that publicly, imagine what they say off camera. So because they said this for the record. And another thing that I think it's this pressure, I think from outside, I think it's what we have to focus now. For instance, let me just put again. So pressure from outside, I think, could come from diplomacy, governments. For instance, the European Parliament in November 26th, they have sent a letter showing their concern about the Amazon, about the new governmental plan for the Amazon, where they say that they want to control the civil society and NGOs in the Amazon. So now the European Parliament sent some parliamentarians from the European Parliament sent a letter. So people like Greta Thunberg and also civil society using what we call the boomerang pattern, the transnational networks to pressure from outside, and also the business sector doing movements to form sustainable supply chains and trying to boycott soybeans that come from areas where there was deforestation in the Amazon or in the Cerrado. For instance, almost all the supermarkets in France, like a Carrefour, Casino, Auchan, the metro system, they all have announced measures to end the use of soy from the forested areas, forested lands in the Amazon, in the Cerrado in Brazil. So right now, because of non-existent policies, I think the only thing we have could be pressures from outside. So that's also not a very uplifting story. It's also a tragic story, but I thank you very much for your attention. And this tree is right by my house. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I guess if our presentations thus far have conveyed the inaction in the face of severe degradation in Australia, and in fact, even denial in the face of degradation in the case of Brazil, I guess the next case on the US will speak to both inaction and denial. I would like to introduce Professor Daniel Fiorino, who's the founding director of the Center for Environmental Policy and a distinguished executive in residence in the School of Public Affairs at American University. He's the author of a range of books, most recently A Good Life on a Finite Earth, The Political Economy of Green Growth. He also served for decades as an analyst and manager at the US Agency for Environmental Protection, and hence remembers better days and in the climate area. So we want to thank him for speaking with us today. And then just as a reminder, after Dan speaks, we will have some time for questions and answers. And we were asking people to please place their questions in the area in Zoom that is for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks for organizing this. It's a great topic. Although you are obviously are not hearing from the climate leadership countries this evening. So good evening, everybody. I wanted to talk a bit about climate change and right-wing populism in the United States. And I'm talking about the right-wing variety of populism. So I want to be clear about that. So here are the topics I wanted to talk about. One is, what is right-wing populism? And I have been part for the last 4 or 5 months of a group, mostly Europeans, but it's led by 2 scholars from Germany. And we're all contributing to or at least proposing for a special issue on populism and climate change for Environmental Politics, the journal. So I'll give you a few ideas from that. I want to talk about how does climate change as an issue fit in with right-wing populism, and if you had to invent a political philosophy that was going to be hostile to climate change, this would probably be it. So climate is a natural target. And then take a look at the Trump administration and how their policies, the administration's policies were, if you look at everything they've done, actually to accelerate the rate of climate change. So I'm more focused on mitigation, and I know our theme is adaptation, but I'm hoping that we can pull out some characteristics on the adaptation side as well. So the definition of right-wing populism that we're using in this special issue project has these elements of right-wing populism. One is hostility to elites, because elites oppose the will of the people, and it's all about reflecting the will of the people, although it's a segment of the people. Another characteristic is the denial of scientific evidence, because again, those are views of elites and based on expertise, which is antithetical to right-wing populism. A strong nationalism, which of course means a hostility to global cooperation and global influences. And I learned a new word, retrotopia, as part of this group, and conformity to a past order and past hierarchy. So visions of the past, the retrotopia, the idealized past. And I think we see these characteristics in the Trump administration. And we also see that all of these do not support action on climate change. Climate change is a global issue. It's based to a large degree on scientific evidence, relies on expertise, involves transformational change. So it's very much in conflict with recognizing and dealing with climate change. And quote here, just from a very interesting review of right-wing parties in Europe, which all but one or two exceptions, Hungary was an exception, right-wing parties were hostile generally towards climate change and the multilateralism and collective action and reliance on science and so on. I'm not going to spend too much on this. Like many people, I've been trying to understand the basis of the right-wing populism in the United States, and the US Republican Party does reflect many of the characteristics of right-wing populism. So I won't get into this, but there are a variety of explanations that focus on conflicting worldviews, and now worldviews are sort of converging along partisan lines, whereas they may have been distributed more broadly in the past. A strong economic resentment, perception that elites have not responded effectively to issues affecting parts of the population. So all of these seem to be contributing. And let me just take a look at this. Clearly, a lot of what's happening is we're getting extreme polarization. We talk about asymmetric polarization. So the Republican Party moving more to the right than the Democratic Party is to the left, but polarization in any event. But this is a simple little graphic from work by Riley Dunlap and some associates. And it starts on the left in 1970, it goes into the mid 20-teens on the far right. And the blue has the US House and Senate votes. And on environmental issues, red has Republican House and Senate votes. This is an index maintained by the League of Conservation Voters. And they've been doing it for a long time. And it's a graphic illustration of the degree of polarization that we're seeing. And so, look back to the 1970s, there may have been grounds for reaching agreement on issues. That's getting increasingly difficult. And now we have a very wide gap. And we see this, climate is one of the most polarized issues. So that early relative bipartisanship on the environment is gone in the US. The breakdown accelerated in the last decade or so. Of 18 issues examined in a recent Pew Foundation poll, climate was the issues of the 18 where there was the most partisan conflict. Other environmental issues, air, water pollution, and so on, was 17th. So we're dealing with some very difficult issues. And we also see very high degrees of differences. Democrats very concerned in general with climate. Republicans absolutely much less concerned. We even have information, some friends, David Kaniski and some colleagues have done some work and find that conflict on climate is now, I would say, infecting other environmental issues, so increasing conflict on those kinds of issues. So I think many people are familiar with the Trump policies. Most of these are on the mitigation side, but we really see right-wing populism playing out in hostility to climate. So withdrawal of the Clean Power Plan was the major Obama initiative for dealing with coal plant emissions. Canceled the phase 2 emission and corporate average fuel economy standards, acted to remove California's legal authority to set more stringent standards, withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, on and on and on, and including undermining scientific capacities and changing the methodological underpinnings used to assess not only scientific but economic aspects of climate issues. And then on the adaptation front, revoked an executive order on preparing the US for adapting to climate change and a similar report on climate adaptation. All US agencies were required to prepare climate adaptation plans, which maybe they've been in the back office, but now are there and can be the basis for new programs. So I think we do see right-wing populism playing out in the United States. We've now seen a shift back in the other way, and that really gets to my last point, was there are really two broad coalitions right now. If we think about this extreme polarization and conflict over climate issues, one coalition thinks that climate is an important issue, that there's a need to act on it, that there's significant costs from ignoring this, but also there are significant opportunities for clean energy and more sustainable agriculture and other changes. Another coalition that is skeptical, if not outright denying the reality of climate change. And we see these playing out in different states. So at a national level, the US is a laggard, but at a state level, states like California and New York and Vermont and Hawaii and most recently Virginia are moving ahead fairly aggressively on clean energy and climate action, while other states are pretty committed to fossil fuels and that course of action. So I see, actually, there are actually 4 possible outcomes but I broke them out. But one is one of these two coalitions could become more dominant and succeed, and we could be moving in the direction of serious climate action or moving in the opposite direction of opposition to climate action. Another possibility is, so the first two are sort of one set of options. Another is that these coalitions find a workable middle ground, but that will be difficult given the degree of partisan polarization, but almost magnified within institutions, I think even more extreme than among voters. Or we could continue to see extreme swings in national policy and more state divergence. And certainly from the Obama to the Trump administrations, we saw very dramatic, head-spinning change in policy. If one coalition isn't able to establish dominance, the sort of pro-climate action, we could see certainly swings back in the other direction. So I will conclude there and we can move on to questions, Todd.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think a first question I would like to ask, using moderator's prerogative, is to sort of ask how it is possible that, you know, popularly elected or parliamentarily elected responsible leaders can actually deny science and not only get away with it, but thrive on it. It seems that, you know, there are special interest arguments that explain part of this, such as the large coal lobbies in Australia and the US, and the large cattle and soy and other industries in Brazil which profit from deforestation of the Amazon. But that can't be all of the answer, given that, as Dan just showed, there's such a sizable group of people, even in the polarized United States and in the other countries, probably even larger groups of people, strongly committed to reducing climate change, especially given the tremendous vulnerability of Australia to the wildfires, and the barrier reef is at risk. And in Brazil, of course, the Amazon. How can we explain this? And I wonder if the three of you could address that very briefly, and then I'll, in the meantime, start taking other questions. Thanks.
Who would you like to go first? Well, I'll dive in if I may. In Australia, a lot of the explanation lies with our political party configuration at the national level. We have the Liberal Party always going into coalition with the National Party, and they're the conservative side of politics. The Australian Labor Party and the Greens are a natural alliance, but they hate each other for various reasons. And because of that, the conservative side of politics tends to prevail. But what's interesting is we do have a right-wing nationalist populist party that's a climate denialist party, and it's called One Nation, and it's headed by Pauline Hanson, but they have a very small vote. And the reason is that the sort of person that appeals to is distributed across the major parties and the National Party. So each of the major parties and the National Party have a strong wing that thinks that way. At the same time, the Liberals also have a cohort that believe in climate action, and so does the ALP, and the Greens are the only ones that consistently do that. And so we've had this serious polarisation. Scott Morrison brought a lump of coal into Parliament when he was Treasurer, supplied by the Minerals Council of Australia that had been lacquered because it's unsafe, waved it around and said, don't be afraid of this bit of coal. So it was a huge stunt. And Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister that abolished our price on carbon in 2014, said coal is good for humanity. So what's going on here? Is it pandering to right-wing populism and winning as a result of that? Or is it simply the revolving door between the lobbyists of the fossil fuel industry and both major parties and the Nationals? And I think it's clearly a bit of both. But at the moment, the little ray of sunshine we have in Australia is Tony Abbott was kicked out of office by an independent, a former Olympic champion called Zali Steggall, and she won the seat of Warringal in Sydney on a climate action campaign. She's now presented a private member's bill in the federal parliament, modelled on the United Kingdom Climate Change Act, and asking for a conscience vote. So our hope is that it'll pick up, obviously the Greens support it, most of Labor, some of Liberal, and maybe one or two Nationals, and they might even get it over the line. If they can pick off, because there's climate supporters in all, but apart from the Greens, there's also right-wing nationalists who are anti-climate change and pro-coal and pro-fossil fuels. So we've actually got possibly a majority in the parliament, but they're distributed across all but the Greens. And so that's an institutional feature of our democracy that's making this hard to be represented, really difficult. But with populism, as Daniel made quite clear, there are right-wing versions, and as you made clear, Todd, there are climate versions. And Simon Tormey wrote a wonderful article about populism where he said we should think about it as a pharmacon. And a pharmacon is a Greek term for a particular medicine that if you get the wrong dose, it'll cause great harm to the body. But if you get the right dose, it will actually make the body get better. So there are certain types of populist movements that will reinvigorate and enliven and make democracy more healthy. But there are many that are actually claiming to speak in the name of the people, but actually undermining democracy. And the final point about climate science denialism, we have a number of politicians who cherry pick science to refute IPCC findings, but no one's called them out on the fact that their claims are a performative contradiction, because they're invoking the authority of science to undermine science. So they recognize that it has authority, because they can't do it in other ways, unless they just appeal to everyday folk wisdom, because climate science is very abstract. That's the other technique that you see.
I'll throw in a couple of points. One is that there is a long-standing scientific denial movement in the United States, documented very nicely in the book Merchants of Doubt. And it goes back to the science behind the health threat of cigarettes, through acid rain, through a number of other issues, and through to climate change. So a very organized, consistent, well-orchestrated effort. So I think that's a factor. I think also it's just the media fragmentation, and it's now possible to communicate with people directly without intermediaries, as certainly President Trump did. And so people have access to all kinds of information, and it's very hard to filter it out. And then in the US, the just identity politics. So, you know, it's a matter of, it's not sort of working out, compromising on issues. It's partisanship defined by one's identity. And we know that people follow cues from their leaders. And if the leaders are saying, you know, climate change isn't proven and it's speculative and we can't take risks and try and respond to that, I think it holds sway with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me try now. I think in Brazil, it has a bit of both what happened in Australia, like when you had the polarization. So Bolsonaro took the opportunity to kind of capture all the votes against the people that were very tired, they were very upset with the Workers' Party. And so the whole context became very polarized, but also they built a lot of constituency using social media, fake news and all that, and also science denialists. And I think they used a lot of this Cambridge Analytics and things that were the political strategy used by Bolsonaro was very similar to the one used by Trump. And they captured the same kind of votes of people that were tired. They were fed up with the Workers' Party and all that. Plus the coalition of the rural farmers, like the big farmers, and the people from the right-wing church, evangelical church, and also people that were also in favor of weapons. So they had a coalition in the Congress, but also they start feeding this fake news in social media, creating a lot of confusion, and plus this polarization. So that's how all end up in Bolsonaro. Our hope now is that these elections that were last week for the municipalities in Brazil, the votes are moving to the center and center right. So we hope that the center can join together with a little bit of the left and try to bring all the votes. So that's our hope, and let's see if that will be possible. But the polarization plus social media plus all, that's the bad result.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, all of you. Robyn, you want to add something? You're muted.
Sorry, just a very quick point. If the focus is adaptation, not mitigation, you'd think that might actually appeal to right-wing populists if you think of all the criteria that Daniel just shared, because the costs of the investment are reaped, the benefits are local, whereas mitigation, they're global and local. And we do find in Australia that there's more attention to an adaptation because of our vulnerability. So as we saw, the government did accept most of the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So it is nowhere near the same degree of contention. So I think that point needs to be said. There's another point too, and we're looking at a broader structural phenomenon that's global, not just, but especially in the developed countries. With a structural shift in modes of capital accumulation towards platform capitalism and the gig economy, we're seeing the decline of unions and the old economy. And so the working class are becoming more conservative. And so social democratic parties around the world are doing the splits. They have to move to the right to keep hold of their base, or they move in the other direction to get the urban literati. who care about climate change. And those votes are now going to Green parties. So they're on a losing streak unless they basically move across and join forces with the Greens. And that's the only way we can get out of the rut we're in Australia. But unfortunately, it's like the Judean Liberation Front fighting the Liberation Front of Judea and forgetting about the Romans. That's the problem in Australia.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great analogy. Okay, and I think that there's a question that that follows from Robyn's point, and that also uses indirectly the sort of the question about the pharmacon, about an amount of populism which might be healthy, and it asks why left-wing populism has failed to politicize climate adaptation, and I guess we would also add mitigation, by highlighting the failure of countries' right-wing governments in dealing with climate change. Why is left-wing populism largely failing? And I guess maybe Robyn addressed some of that in her last comments, but would you all have any further statements about that? Anybody?
Well, I think a challenge in the United States is, I mean, the characteristics I outlined of populism don't really apply to the left wing because it's very global. It puts a lot of emphasis on scientific expertise. So it doesn't quite fit that. I think the issue in the United States is that climate tends to be fairly low on the list of issues that people are concerned about. So even though it's high among Democrats, so it may help activate votes, it doesn't seem to be a deciding factor. Other factors, economy, race, immigration, and so on, seem to be more important. So I think climate among the electorate at large, this is not that big of an issue.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment?
Cristina, I'll wait for you. You can go next.
Okay, so the question was if left-wing populism, they also failed to incorporate climate. But if you think about Evo Morales and also in Latin America and Venezuela, well, the problem is, like, if I see from this Latin American side, is that climate by itself is not an issue. It's like they all come together, like in Bolivia or in Ecuador, it's Pachamama and also forest and climate. So it's very hard to entangle, you put only climate. So I think that's one thing also if you think about more left-wing kind of populism like Evo Morales or even Venezuela, they had things with more like Mother Nature, other issues that was brought into the agenda. The problem is that extractivist economies, economies that depend too much on export of commodities, like oil in Ecuador, soybeans and oil mining in Brazil, and all these countries, is very hard, even from left or right, to deal with environmental issues that when you think about their trade balance and all that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, if I can just jump in there. The climate movement in Australia and in many other countries, as represented by the school strikes and by Extinction Rebellion and the climate emergency movement, are not punching through. It's as much a generational movement. It's mainly younger folk, and they're all saying, like Greta Thunberg, listen to the science. But it's not a class-conscious movement. It's a generational movement, and the claim for climate emergency is not something, it works with adaptation when there is a real present danger, but it's not punching through for mitigation. In fact, it's quite oxymoronic because Extinction Rebellion say, it's a climate emergency, what should we do? We should hold a citizens' assembly, which is a wonderfully slow and deliberative way. It's not like bring out the military, it's let's have a really long talk and see if we can reach consensus, and good luck with that. So there's a kind of oxymoronic character. It's not a Schmittian decisionism or state of exception like a Agamben or a securitization move. It's something quite new and novel and oxymoronic. So it's finding its feet, but there's lots of draft climate emergency laws around the world, and I'm not sure it's quite the right way to go about it. I think it is, I mean, we've just got national legislation going through now to give the national government power to declare a climate emergency, but most people think about when a bushfire is raging or a flood is threatening. It's got to be imminent. And to sustain a wartime mobilization permanently, which is what's required to beat this problem, is a very big ask. I think the slow burn of coalition forming of the kind that Daniel was mentioning is a little more realistic in the way it works. So it's the right-wing climate populism is fired up, but it's got a narrow set of goals, and it's not dealing with the complexity of the changing class configuration. And that's what I think, that's the slow, hard political work that needs to be really attentive to that.
Great. Well, thank you. I fear we only have a few more minutes, and I think I'll ask one more general question. The question that several of the US participants have is whether there is any optimism with the new Biden administration and its ability to appeal more broadly and sort of help shape this consensus and move that coalition building forward. I think, though, I want to broaden the question and ask each of you to perhaps answer the question and also add any last words about, you know, something, if there are any grounds for optimism, if, you know, when will this end? How will we get out of this log jam, I guess we are all in? And sort of, if you could answer for your country's political system, and also, as a couple of questions say, you know, why are we having this wave of climate populism now? I mean, how do we solve this problem at the international level as well? And I know that's a lot to ask in, you know, 3 or 4 minutes, but hey, that's what we're here for, is to answer the tough questions. So, thank you very much. And it's better you than me, so thank you.
Well, I'll go first, since you mentioned President-elect Biden. Certainly the Biden administration can stop the bleeding in the sense of, you know, stopping the regression in a number of different areas. Lacking a legislative majority. I mean, even if, you know, the Georgia elections for the Senate give them a thin majority, it'll still be difficult to do much that's sweeping. President Biden can do a lot of things administratively and through existing legislation, although I'm concerned about potential court reversals for some things they might do, say, under the Clean Air Act. So yeah, I think we can do some new things. What worries me is, what can you do without legislative authority? And number two, what if in 4 years we go back in the other direction? The other coalition then establishes dominance and we're running back the other way, and any gains that are lost. So there's certainly a potential to accomplish some things, but I think it's a little too soon to tell what the long-term trend will be.
So we have structural electoral problems as part
Yeah.
of, I guess, yeah. Anybody else like to speak to the broad question or offer any other concluding comments?
Sure.
Thank
In
you.
Australia, as I briefly flagged in my presentation, there's a lot of interesting action at the subnational level. South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, and the Australian Capital Territory all have climate change legislation. South Australia preceded the so-called Gold Standard UK Act by a year, and it inspired Tasmania and the ACT to follow. Victoria's made amendments that they've all got legislated 2050 targets and budgets moving towards that, and incredible commitments to renewable energy. So there's a lot happening there, and that's compensating for failures at the national level. With the Paris Agreement, I'm actually a defender of the agreement because it's the best we could have got given the long burning divisions. They had to sidestep around them and give countries flexibility. And that it was that or nothing. And in politics, sometimes something is better than nothing. But more importantly, it's a document around which the world mobilizes. The 1.5 degrees, that magic thing brought in there by the high ambition coalition headed by the former foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, was the signature achievement of that for me. And that's a source of rallying. So everything now depends on national action. And when you've got countries with let's just say the wrong governments who don't care about this problem. You've still got mobilisation at the national level, particularly in federal systems, where you can do a lot at the subnational and city and municipal level. And that's where it's happening. So in many ways, it's become local again. You know, all politics is ultimately local, and it's very local here in Australia. Darebin City Council in the Melbourne municipal area was the first city council to declare a climate emergency. And it's really quite green. A lot of the councils in Australia are green. So you see all the energy and activism there, and also business is starting to move. I mean, this is the second week of the United Nations Climate Dialogues, which is a substitute for the COP that couldn't happen because of COVID, but will be at Glasgow next year. And there's a rollout of a whole lot of interesting initiatives. So I think the tide's turning. The real question is whether it will turn fast enough.
True, yeah, thank you.
Your question about, so Brazil, I think for us, Biden is a kind of a hope, but still we have this competition between China and the US. I think the ability of Biden's government to pressure Brazil is a little bit constrained by the relation of China, Brazil, China, the US, and how this is one point. But at least we, like people in the academia and activists, were very hopeful when Biden was elected. I think signs of hope, the youth movements, I think they offer some kind of sign of hope. Subnational governments in Brazil, some of them, yes. And some of the mayors, they did have some proposals for climate adaptation there in their platform for election in the local level. Even in the municipal elections in Brazil, none of the main capital mayors that were elected, none of them were supporters of Bolsonaro. So that gives me at least a little bit of hope that at least there will be a kind of center coalition to get rid of the far right. And but in terms of the Paris Agreement, at least for the target that was set for 2021, Brazil is not going to achieve. So we really will have to wait for the next government in the federal level. And as I said, I think our strategy is now really to prevent harm, then instead of doing something good, we're just trying to prevent harm and, you know, focus on that. And another sign of hope, if you think, could be pressure from the market, like for sustainable supply chains in the soy sector, mining, and all that. So really, the people say that they don't want to buy soy from Brazil if it comes from areas in the deforestation in the Amazon or in the Cerrado, or if it's mine minerals from indigenous lands, if they boycott and look for sustainable supply chains, that would be also some sign of hope, at least in Brazil. That would depend a lot on commodities. And also, if the vaccine is approved, I think that's another sign of hope for all of us.
Todd, you're...
Sorry, thank you. And to thank you all, and to express also signs of hope that we need soon, and to send abrazos and thanks and elbow shake panelists, and thank you. And to again, please ask you to join us on February 3rd for the last talk in this series, and to again thank you and wish you a very good night. Thanks for joining us. Thank you to all the panelists. And sorry we couldn't answer all the questions. A video of this webinar should be posted at the Center for Environmental Policy within a few days, and we'll send it to the panelists as well. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.